I want to take you to a place where I know many of you have been. Excuse me for a moment. I've been in bed with a cold for a few days, so that water is an elixir. And the place is 56th Street. That's not downtown LA. 56th Street near Broadway, in front of a McDonald's. And the time, and what I want to ask you to think about, is noon on a Monday on that near corner where many of you have been, worked, stood, traveled. So many of us have walked those streets. And we know that you don't hear a single sound, you hear a cacophony. You hear sounds, you see sights, you take in so much stimulation that you might get back to your apartment or hotel exhausted, not by what you did, but what you took in, what you experienced, what interacted with you, bumped against you, people, and noises, and traffic, and Uber, and taxis, and people walking, and people running, and people on their phones, and bumping into you, and all of life that happens on a corner, on a street, in any city, and even in small towns in which many of us live. And what we tend to do in those moments is train ourselves to zone it out. Just get on with life. Move forward with your own thoughts, your own conversation, your own destination, your goals, and let all that be a background noise, a soundscape to your life. Now, I want to take you on a particular day, a Monday, in front of that McDonald's to that place, and I want you to imagine a woman, a white woman, a professional woman in her clothes, coming out of a lunch meeting, coming out of a meeting, going to lunch, and she's passing that McDonald's in the front. She hears a small voice. And the voice that calls out to her amidst all the sounds and voices of a street and of a city says, "Ma'am, have you got any change?" And she barely hears it. It's just another instrument playing in the symphony of New York. But something happens in her mind that she doesn't even understand. Something in that moment makes her stop. And she's heard that particular call so many times in her life. "Ma'am, can you spare some change?" But this time, something within her makes her stop. And she turns around to see the source of that sound, that call. And she sees a small African-American boy there. And she says, "I realized at that moment he was just a boy. He was 11 years old." She realized, she learned. He had bony shoulders and big eyes. And he said to her again, "Ma'am, can you spare some change? I'm hungry." And she came over to him and she said, "If you want lunch, I'll take you to McDonald's." He said, "Can I have a hamburger and fries?" She said, "Sure." He says, "How about a milkshake and a Big Mac?" She says, "How about if I eat lunch with you? Would that be okay?" And the little boy pauses, and then he says, "Sure." And they sit down to lunch together in McDonald's, probably a little afraid of each other, a little weary and wary, wondering what that encounter will hold, because they've seen each other so many times in different forms and ages of their lives. But they've never had an encounter that pulled them together at a table, eye to eye over food. And I want to tell you something about the end of that story now in the beginning, because a table and food would mean so much in this story. The story which you might recognize is from a book by Laura I want to say her name correctly, Laura, I made a note of it, Schroff, and the book is called An Invisible Thread. And that boy comes to know her and she comes to know him over the course of 150 Mondays. 150 times they meet for lunch. I don't know what it is for you to hear this story, but when I hear the story, I think about what it is simply to be a human being, not just them, because they're somebody distinct, somebody I've never met, you've never met, but every one of us have had the vulnerability of those encounters and those moments and those missed opportunities for encounter. It's called the spirituality of knowing, of being, and of seeing. It's about seeing another human being and doing what only we can do. It's a human gift. It's our magic, which is to make them no longer invisible. If you remember the book Les Miserables, or the musical Les Miserables, it ends with a glorious line. And the line is said by Jean Valjean, the lead character in the story. And he says, to love another person is to see the face of God. Just think about that for a second, what that means. To love another person is to see the face of God. He didn't come to that realization, that magical moment, that line of his life through romance that was absent. He came to it through torture, through a beleaguered journey. But what he realized on that painful journey of his life was that there were sparks of light, and the sparks of light didn't come from above. They weren't like a giant torch coming down from the heavens, and they weren't from giant human-made torches shining up toward great buildings in that city, or any city in the world, or even toward the stars above. It was a particular, unique form of light, which you and I contain in us, and only we contain, which is the ability of human beings to shine light on human beings to realize that they are all human beings. What does it take to stop, to turn? It takes courage, and it takes generosity. Why courage? Because of vulnerability. Because we guard ourselves against exposing ourselves. And in a moment like that, when somebody looks you in the eye, you can't help but apprehend their whole story. It's not about $1. It's not about a Big Mac. It's about a human being that suddenly you care about. It's about proximity, one person to another. It's about pulling closer to another human being. And so much of our lives is teaching us to pull away from the stranger, to back away from one another, to find our own autonomy, to be rugged individuals, and to go forth only with the people that we trust around us as our solid and edifying team. And yet what God asks us to do is not to segregate ourselves into my team and yours. That's what we do. That's our human want, not God's. Nowhere in the Torah does God say that we should create the last names and the nationalities and the languages and the cultures that would divide us. That's a human condition that we created. What God gave us out of chaos and void and darkness was light. The Kabbalists believe that every single one of us carries a spark of that initial light. And then the question is, what do we do if we are containers of holy light? We can use it internally only to see ourselves, or we can realize that that's our obligation, our sacred obligation, to be bearers of light to one another. Not only one another whom we know and see, whose names and stories we know, but to see another human being. Because the beginning of loving another human being, which is to see the face of God, is simply to see them. Think about our world and all the unseen people, because they're not as smart or not as clean or not as bright or not as rich or not as close to us or live on that side of the road and not this one. Think about all the unseen people who are just like us, but whom we meander past constantly, almost creating friction between us, warmth, but we don't bother to stay still long enough to create it. But all of us, whether it's somebody standing in a doorway holding a door open for us or doing it for them, isn't merely a sign of good manners and good upbringing. It's a sign of willingness to be vulnerable, to hold that door, to look at another human being, and to see the face of God. To hold that door, to say, I will reduce myself in this moment to enlarge you. What did God do in the beginning, in Genesis, in that beginning? God did something called tzimtzum, and every mother here knows the experience of tzimtzum, which is to contract oneself, even painfully, to create something as glorious as new life. So the rabbis, the Kabbalists tell us that to create you and us and all of this, God had to contract God's self. Isn't that just an amazing idea? What an image. And if the Torah, as Heschel tells us, doesn't teach us much about God, but everything about us, about being human, then what can we learn about what it is to reduce ourselves, even to contract ourselves, so that another person can stand taller beside us? So that when we bow low to another human being or simply look them in the eyes, when the waitress comes to our table, and instead of merely taking our order, she has an encounter that reminds her that she's as human as the person sitting at the table with their credit card. When we ask her, but sincerely, not because we want a better table or better service, but sincerely, how are you? And hear her story. I remember a delivery guy coming to my office, and I'll tell you the reason a delivery guy was coming to my office. The Woolsey fire evacuated our family November 8th. I know it well. I remember the time of day and night. We're still evacuated. But getting deliveries isn't always that practical, so sometimes they come to where we're living, a hotel room, sometimes the front desk of a hotel, and sometimes to the office. And one day a man came in my office, and I said, "Hi, George," and he gave me my dry cleaning, which is what he dropped off. And before he left, I said, "George, how are you?" And he stopped, and he took a couple steps back into the office, and he said, "My 18-year-old niece didn't wake up. They think it was heart failure, even at her age." And what I remember from that moment was what it took to stop what I was doing, just simply to say, "How are you?" but with the intention of hearing and seeing another human being's story. And I think about a time when I was at Kaiser and I was getting my blood taken, something I hate, and maybe slightly to distract myself from the phlebotomist, however you spell that, and the needle, I know how to spell that. I decided to ask her about herself. She's from Ecuador. We had a good conversation about Ecuador. I told her about myself. She asked me about my life and my work and my singing. We spoke a little Spanish. And then she asked me to sing to her just as the needle was going in my left arm. And I swear, Chris, my pitch was right on. And I sang, "Bésame, bésame mucho, como si fuera esta noche la última vez." And then a couple vials of blood were drawn and the ordeal was over. But I'm saying, because I'm remembering moments when I had the opportunity to have a transaction with a person. This is the service that I give. This is the service you give. We swipe our credit card, we meet for a moment, and then we depart from each other's lives. Yet every time we meet somebody in a shop, at school, on the playground, in the office when we're waiting to be seen by somebody else, all the encounters that fill most of the hours of every single day when we're not sitting alone at home, we're encountering. And the question is, are we seeing? Or are we doing what New Yorkers and so many of us do, which is like racehorses, putting blinkers on to get our agenda met, instead of looking around for opportunities to see their agendas, to hear their stories? Every single one of us, regardless of what we believe about our own creation, every single one of us was born with what the rabbis call yitzarot, which are fighters within us. There are inclinations. They're the drivers of our behaviors. And one the rabbis call yetzer hara, which is essentially the bad inclination, but hold on to that idea and that concept for a moment. And the other is yetzer hatov, which is the good inclination, but the rabbis say life isn't as simple as that. We can't be bifurcated, broken in half to only good and only bad. Some of the greatest creations of the world and in our lives came because of that yetzer hara, what we might call evil. Those great buildings of New York, the rabbis say, that's what creates those. It's ambition and drive to create something lasting and extraordinary. And the yetzer hatov, which is so sweet and so good, can sometimes shrink us to where we're barely visible in the world. But every one of us was born from our first waking moment with appetites. At first, it was for simple nurture, for drink and food, to sustain our brains and to grow our bodies and our limbs. And then as we grew new appetites, which were power, and even our own sexual strivings, and even our place in the world, and to be seen and to be noticed, and all the things that this book describes, which can either be the greatest source of our strength and well-being and nurture, or devour us, as we know. What ultimately elevates or destroys human beings almost always, and is always on the cover of those magazines when we stand in the market, it's appetites. Look at the story and find the appetite. Look at the story. Look at the face, the picture on the cover, and the story. The reason why they're on the cover of that story is because of a particular appetite that they allowed, perhaps, instead of to elevate them, to diminish them and shrink them and pull them away from other people. And yet it would be easy to say that's just about the them, those people that we don't know, the celebrities, the politicians, all those people who do wrong things and don't belong with us. But all of us belong with us because all of us are here to realize our own fallibility. Every single human being struggles with their appetites. Not one of us will go through life without that appetite. And one of the appetites that every human being needs, met and fed, is to matter, is to be seen, is to matter even to a stranger. That's enough. That steadies the fast-beating heart. Every single person has this great yearning, this desire to know that another person smiled at them, which means that they saw them, that another person listened to this story, which means that they ultimately care about them and their story. I think about this last year. I told you that we've been evacuated. I'll tell you another part of the story. As challenging as that was personally, to be moving and not having our stability of our home, maybe it threw me into one of the most extraordinary and important years of my life. And what made this year extraordinary and important was one word: encounters. Encounters with strangers. Encounters with other people who were, until those moments, the other in my life and in my world. You know that last May I stood holding the arms and being held in the arms of Pope Francis on St. Peter's Square in front of thousands and thousands of people. It was an extraordinary moment in my life to be privileged to be not only in an audience with that man, the leader of 1 billion people on the planet, but to be in that kind of close encounter with whispered conversation and sharing with the Pope the blessing from the book of Numbers in Hebrew and then in English. And I walked away from that thinking not only about what I experienced, but I wondered, could it have shaped people's views who saw it on the large screens left and right of me? Did anybody go away seeing an encounter that made them rethink their encounters and what they might be willing to encounter and whom they might be willing to get closer to in our world? And then I came back and I saw that story going and that image and those stories on the internet and in print, and I realized hundreds of thousands of people might have been with me essentially on St. Peter's Square standing with the Pope. And what I wonder is, what does it do to us? I know what it did to me. It made me rethink the other with a capital O in my life. It made me rethink what it is to have proximity to people who are different and other than us. Another story I'll tell you is being in Azerbaijan just before that. Azerbaijan, a country 96% Muslim. One of the few Jews, 20,000 Jews there on the ground. What that meant to have close conversations over food. Always the best way to converse. With Muslims and with Baptists and with Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians. To learn what it is to be them and to realize that after that meal and after that encounter, it was foolish or even untrue to say that we were the other to one another. We knew something more. And when you know something more, you inherently see the face of God. You inherently care more. And I came back, it was Ramadan. I've never been a part of Ramadan. But Ramadan, that holy time in the Muslim calendar, my wife sat meal after meal with Muslims, sharing their prayers, sharing their food, unfortunately eating too soon when I realized they were fasting. I was the only one eating the dates on the table, but they forgave me, so I hope God will forgive me. But again, I saw in all of those conversations and encounters, and in all the conversations and encounters that I've had with you over this year, what it is to reconfigure, realign my concept of who I am in relation to who you are. There's a law in physics called the law of proximity. And the law of proximity says that molecules at a distance of a certain point from one another cannot adhere to one another. That's physics. I don't understand physics, but I understand that. If molecules are too far apart by a particular distance, they can will it and pray it and want it, but they absolutely cannot pull together. While you and I might not see the relevance because we don't care enough about what's happening on a molecular level in our world, it's the same that's happening to us. At too great a distance, we can't care enough about each other. At this distance, we can't care enough about each other. It's too far. It's too far. It's too great a distance to actually know and care and see the color of each other's eyes. It's too great a distance to actually feel what it is to feel not only sympathy but empathy for another story, and to realize that ultimately when we encounter and have these close and beautiful and sacred encounters, we are changed by them, and so are they. We create an obligation of closeness. We create a sense of familiarity. We create the sense of holiness even if we're not religious and don't understand what sacred or mundane mean and how they might differ from one another. What I want to ask you to do as you go into a year in which you might say, well, what can I do differently? I read these words in this book day after day, today and tomorrow and next week, and sometimes I come away from a talk, a sermon, a service asking myself, but what am I actually going to change? One thing that's tangible that you might change and that I'll continue to commit to changing is closing distance. Closing the distance and making an effort whenever possible to realize that the blinders are on. And often these days, the blinder looks like this. We're bumping into poles. We're not seeing one another. We're not seeing traffic. I heard that in Israel, they're putting on the ground reminders that traffic's coming across us. Why? Because they know everybody's looking down. What happens to human encounter? What happens to seeing and appreciating and knowing and connecting when we connect only via satellites rather than hearts and souls? I'll tell you one more story of encounter. My son Jonah and I were in Alaska in the summer. It was early in the morning, and we were coming out of our tiny little hut where we spent the night to go fishing, and we were matched with a couple of guys whom we didn't know. One was called Marion, I'll tell you that name. Another one called Nick, and I'd never met Marion or Nick, and we got to the cars, and they saw us. And Marion said to me, do you guys want to travel with us? We're going on the same boat on the Kenai River, the Kasilof, one of these rivers. I said, sure. So Jonah and I jumped in the back of this mighty American pickup truck, bigger than the room I was in. And we were sitting with two guys. I have to tell you, they and we must have needed Google Translate about every sentence to understand each other. They were from rural Georgia. And we were from some place called Calabasas, Agoura, rural Georgia. And what happened was on the journey, Jonah and I were sitting in the back trying. He'd say to me, what did he say? And I said, tell me that again. I didn't catch that. And I'm sure he was saying to Nick in the front, what did they say? Again, we need that translator when we talk to one another, even in this country. And at some point in the conversation, in the drive, Marion, one of the men, the older of the two, turned to Jonah and said, Jonah, what do you do? And Jonah said, well, I do audiovisual. I have an event lighting company, sound. And Jonah and I knew where it was going. And then he said, Ron, what do you do? And I looked at Jonah. Jonah kind of pressed my knee on his. And I said, I'm a clergyman. It's honest to being a clergyman. I'm not lying. I just thought maybe that'll sit and we'll go fish. And he said, what denomination? And Jonah kind of pushed his knee against mine a little further. I felt the bone on his and the bone on mine. And I said, Jewish, I'm a rabbi. I just leapt in. And I heard from the front seat, oh. And the rest of that drive was a little longer than the first half. And we got to the river, and Jonah and Nick were on the front of the boat, this aluminum boat, and Marion and I were sitting at the back, and Marion looked at me under his baseball cap, and he said, I want your card. I said, okay. I said, sure, what for? He said, I have questions. I said, sure. What questions? And he said, I know a lot about us. I don't know about you, Jews. And I said, oh, Marion, we've got a lot of fishing to do. Ask me any question you want. And at the end of the trip, I'm going to give you my card. And I'll tell you that one of the calls that I got before Rosh Hashanah this week was from Marion, my friend in Georgia, telling me in tears about his struggles, hearing my struggles, hearing what it means to be just brothers, two human beings on the planet. Sure, we needed Google Translate at certain points. But what we ultimately understood was Georgia, California, older man and younger man, Christian and Jew, were labels that if we want will divide us till the end of time, unless we find each other. Fishing, hunting, eating, spending human encounters together. So I leave you with this thought as you go into the rest of this holy day. What's holy about an ordinary moment is when you see another person and therein see the face of God. Let's look. Let's see one another. Let's look for encounters. Let's find the invisible people. All of us are those invisible people at times in our lives. All of us are the ones who need to be heard. All of us are the ones who need an embrace, or simply, most simply, a look in the eyes that says, I see you. L'Shana Tova.